Okay, so we're getting into the next section. This is week 3, and we're discussing narrative and the emergence of consciousness of self. So we touched on consciousness of self in the first PowerPoint, and we're going to go into it a little bit deeper in terms of human development. So let's explore an idea. A new level of consciousness develops in humans when we are children. Okay, so we're saying it's new since birth, right? So it's marked by a new sense of self, and it's made possible via our verbal interaction with our caretakers. It's marked by the childhood stories that we create based on our experiences, right? So let's compare this idea with typical developmental psychology. So in the past couple decades, we've had a pretty standard idea of human development and our psyche, our personality, how we develop emotionally, how we develop with traits based on a linear model. And that model says at a certain age, our brain develops in a pretty typical pattern, and it allows us to form this kind of relationship. It allows us to speak in this way. It allows us to have these motor reflexes, that kind of thing. And we have that standard, and in every psychology class, you learn about the same ideas. You learn about Piaget's model of development, how a baby develops, and suddenly a baby is 6 months and the baby can sit up and make eye contact, and at 1 the baby walks and starts babbling, mama, dada, right? So what's wrong with this idea? Well, it's not all wrong. Obviously, they were right with the motor part, right? Typically at 6 months, a baby does crawl and learn to sit up on its own, and around 1, most babies are trying to walk, right? That's pretty typical. However, from a conscious awareness perspective, it gets a little tricky trying to create a standardized measure for how we all develop. What's typical for consciousness? Well, it can't really be explained with a typical model that we have been exposed to in the past few decades, right? Because not every child's environment is the same, right? So when we talk about the phenomenology, say that 10 times fast, or those raw feels we talked about, just the experience of being exposed to stimuli, and that experiential perspective of the child can't be ignored, right? So if you look at typical developmental psychology, they tend to ignore the child's experience, the child's active experience, right? They also tend to view our development from a systems perspective, from an information processing model, rather than an emotional, experiential one, right? This is such an ornate and intricate part of our lives. It can't really be explained from a standard systems idea, which is kind of how they view our brain. They're saying that our language and our emotions are often formed on the brain's ability to grow. And they don't really account for what we're experiencing in our environment and how different that can be from one child to another. We also organize human development like a formula, and that doesn't necessarily work, right? Human development is not universal. Like we said, a lot of motor development is pretty universal. Most humans develop physically very similarly unless there's something that's abnormal, right? Or different. But intellectually, emotionally, consciousness-wise, it's really on a child-to-child basis. depending on their experiential perspective. Okay, so we need to start viewing it as an individual experience, which is cultivated by our environment. Well, okay, we keep saying environment. What do we mean by environment? So when we say environment, we mean who are the people that are shaping this baby? Well, the caretakers, most likely, mom or dad or grandparents or adopted parents or foster parents or whoever is the main caretaker of this child is a huge part of their environment because they are modeling the behavior that the baby is going to imitate, right? Is that caretaker making eye contact? Is that caretaker responding to the baby's needs, responding to the baby's requests, like cries? Is the caretaker responding consistently to those cries? What is the baby seeing on a daily basis? Well, if the baby is suddenly crawling, the baby's main interaction is at floor level. Well, is that caretaker on the floor playing with the baby? Or is the caretaker ignoring the baby and putting the baby in a room with a baby gate and leaving them in there for a while? Hopefully not, but people parent differently. Is that baby getting emotional modeling, or is the baby spending a lot of time on its own? These are questions to ask that immediately reflect the environment that the baby is exposed to. Okay, so we now know that it's critical to study the environment, particularly the linguistic, the cultural, the social, and the affiliative experience in order to understand the developmental capacity of that child. Okay, so we're basically saying that if we're curious about how that child can develop, we need to look at the interaction that they're experiencing with that caretaker or sibling or whomever. We need to look at the linguistic qualities of that main model. We need to look at the cultural experience, what's going on in the home or the community, right? Older standards of thought said that we are born equipped with all the mechanisms in our brain needed to construct a reality and solve logical problems. This is outdated, right? Yes, we have the mechanisms in our brain that trigger our motor reflexes. That's all pretty standard. That's all pretty typical that occurs within the same ages. We said that. But we're not born with all the mechanisms we need to become emotionally intelligent people with language, with interactive patterns, with our narratives, right? These things are extremely reliant upon those environments that we're talking about. So, what this theory is called is the experiential child theory. So rather than viewing cognitive development in terms of a single cause of brain matter, we're not saying that the brain is equipped for all of this. We're saying that the brain is equipped with some mechanisms, but we rely as humans on our environment to cultivate what we need in terms of interactive patterns, right? And that makes sense. We can't interact only with ourselves, right? So that theory is called the experiential child. It's pretty self-explanatory. What the child is actively experiencing forms its consciousness, forms its narrative. Okay, so we view development as an ongoing, self-organizing, developing system, meaning our development does not just suddenly occur with the change of our brains. It is constantly developing, it's constantly changing, it's constantly forming. It's self-organizing, which means we experience stimuli, we take in stimuli, we process it, and we change, we morph, and we learn, right? That stimuli could be As a baby, seeing our caretaker smile, we smile back. Hearing our caretaker label an item, toy, book, car, whatever, we learn to label that item, and then we associate the meaning, right? So it's constantly developing, and that's how we explain consciousness, right? So we're kind of throwing out the outdated developmental psychology theories. They're not bad, they're not entirely wrong. They just haven't considered that the child itself has an effect on their own development based on their experience. Okay, we need to give kids more credit, essentially. We also need to give our environment a little more credit for having such a large role in the formation of our consciousness, in the formation of our narrative. Okay, so let's talk about that self-organizing ongoing system again. Consider a system that develops as we encounter small changes in our environment. So let's think about a baby, right? Their development, let's view it as an ongoing system. When we encounter a new behavior or a new pattern, we cultivate that pattern in ourselves. So if you have a 6-month-old who is suddenly smiling or clapping or waving, that behavior or that social pattern that they are doing has been cultivated via someone in their environment. Maybe the dad has been smiling and clapping with the baby over and over again, and suddenly the baby has learned it, right? We don't have a mechanism in our brain saying at 6 months we smile and we wave and we clap, right? We rely very heavily on our environment to cultivate these patterns. And these are social patterns that become narratives, right? As soon as the baby starts associating that smile with daddy's smile, oh, when I clap, that makes daddy smile, that makes daddy laugh. That infant starts to realize they create humor, right? They start to learn what feels good. They start to learn what makes others happy. So they do it over and over again, right? Children are such intelligent systems themselves. They incorporate and respond to this information. This information is often in the form of a caretaker and their behavior, and then they respond to the challenges posed, right? So if you have a baby who unfortunately is being neglected or maybe is not being responded to in a consistent way, how is a baby smart in this sense? Well, babies know initially that they need to cry to get what they need, to get nourishment, to get attention, right? If a baby cries and the mother doesn't respond, the baby cries again and again and again and again. And eventually, either the mother responds or the baby will learn that they have to conserve their energy. It's very sad. But on a more positive note, with that smiling and clapping behavior, if a baby is sitting there and not getting attention from the mom or the dad, they might start clapping just independently, initiate that behavior, and they're likely to get a response from the caretaker. That's not just happenstance. The baby has learned that in the past, that behavior has received attention. So they're going to do it again, and they're going to learn, right? I want you to check out this link. I want you to watch this video, and I want you to just make a note of a few things that you've noticed that reflect our conversation here. And I may post some questions for the discussion board about the video. So just take a few notes on what you witness. But essentially, the video is proving this point that children rely very heavily on the language that caretakers use to provide information for them in order to build their perception of the world, right? So I want you to particularly take note of the little experiment they do with the two children and the buckets, okay? And I want you to make notes of what you think about how the man presents the information in both series, okay? And I just want you to just make a note of what you think about that. Okay, so pause the PowerPoint and then continue on. Okay, I'm gonna keep going here. So let's talk about child development in terms of consciousness. And we're gonna talk about stages, okay? So I want you to picture the stages of locomotion for a baby, okay? So you can refer to this video as a starting point. Okay, so it's just kind of a funny video checking out how babies go from mainly crawling on the floor to standing, walking, and experiencing the world at a totally different level. So we're going to use this analogy as a physical perspective creating their consciousness and their awareness and their narrative. So if a baby is limited to, if a baby's consciousness is limited by its environment, how is that? Well, if they're only crawling on the floor, they can only see what's at ground level, right? They can only see what's in front of them, or when they're being held, right? So that's kind of like a passive experience. If they're being held and the mother or the father is walking around, they might passively see objects right in front of them, but they're not choosing those. They're not choosing what they see, right? So that really reflects their development. It's tied to the bond they have with their mother or their father, and it makes their goal to learn to crawl faster and more effectively so they can choose where they will be, what they will learn about, what they will view, okay? So as a baby's locomotion progresses, as the baby starts maybe kind of scaling the furniture a bit, starts standing and pulling from, maybe one chair to the next piece of furniture, it can now see at a totally new level. It has more control over what it's viewing, and it's tying more of the family's behavior patterns to meaning. Can you imagine only being able to get around on the floor and only being able to see at the baby's level? You should try it. If you have a little one that's on the floor, get down on the floor with them, and you'll be amazed at what it's like to stay on the floor for a while and only be able to see what is at the floor level, right? You're missing a lot. As the baby can stand, they're more closely and actively a part of family behavior, like walking, like eating, like playing. So more and more knowledge is available as the babe physically develops, just as the baby's consciousness is developing. So our consciousness develops as we physically develop, as our use of narrative, language, culture, and interaction develops as well. Okay, so when does consciousness really take an important turn for a baby? Typically, this happens around 9 months, okay? This is kind of the hallmark age of the beginning of narrative drafting and consciousness formation, okay? So somewhere between 9 and 18 months, remember, there isn't a particular day of age that the baby turns that suddenly this is all available. Remember, the brain surely has an important part in making available the mechanism that we need in order to communicate and to form consciousness or to form a perspective on the world. But it doesn't just happen independently. right? This consciousness formation happens as a result of us interacting with our caretakers, interacting with our siblings, and what's going on in our environment. So it's a combination of the function of the mechanisms in our brain. For example, um, you know, studying images, beginning speech, those are functions of our brain, right? But those things do not develop unless we have the environmental stimuli to cultivate them, right? So that's kind of the major point we're making here. So somewhere between 9 and a year and a half of age, a baby and a caretaker begin to share mutual interest in things. So you'll see a lot of pointing. Um, the baby will point to something and look at the mom or the dad. And then hopefully the mom will look and talk to the baby and make eye contact with the baby. This is what we call mutual interest. The baby starts realizing that they can communicate with mom through babble, through pointing, through sharing a gaze. Sometimes it's so cute. You'll even see babies, if they're, this is often a sign of intelligence as well, if they will grab the mother's face or the dad's face and push it towards something. It's funny, sometimes you'll see a baby drinking a bottle or nursing from a mom, and the mom will be talking to someone else or looking, somewhere other than the baby, and the baby will pull the mother's face down to them and say, "Hey, mom, look at me," So the baby is sharing mutual interest and attention with the caretaker. Okay, so we talked about baby pointing, mom responds, mom points, baby follows with gaze. This is an interactive joint attention and is the catalyst for language development. Initial baby talk through advanced sentence formation. So as babies begin to associate meaning to the words that mother and dad are saying, right? And this all happens because they are independently experiencing the world, not just because the brain tells them to, right? The brain could be signaling the ability to talk, but if the environment doesn't call for that, the baby will never do that, right? I'm going to provide a link for a case of a little girl who unfortunately was severely mistreated and neglected and was raised like an animal in her own home. And though she was born as a typical developing baby, she was not treated as she should have been. She was not nurtured, right? And as a result, her development is completely abnormal and completely animalistic, okay? Which just kind of proves the point that no matter how typically developing or advanced our brains are, if the environment does not call for a particular mechanism or for a particular behavior, it's never going to happen, okay? And as a result, our consciousness will not develop. Okay, so obviously, researchers view that this social awareness, where the baby starts recognizing what mom is interested in, this is quite a human idea. Okay, I want you guys to take a quick look at this mirror recognition test. And this is often a test that is viewed to gauge whether or not a baby starts to form self-consciousness, right? Or a cognitive self, okay? So you're going to see the baby will look in the mirror and the parent will put a little mark or a piece of something on the baby's face, innocently enough. And the baby will look in the mirror, and if the baby recognizes that there's something on their face and they go to wipe it off their own face, we can gauge that child has a general understanding of a cognitive self. meaning they recognize that what they're viewing in the mirror is themselves, right? And this typically happens at about 18 months or later, okay? So you'll see if a 6-month-old were to sit in front of the mirror, or, sometimes even a 1-year-old will look in the mirror and they'll recognize maybe even that they see a spot on their face in the mirror, and they'll go and touch the mirror. They won't realize that they are looking at a reflection of themselves, right? So it's just one more example of that an age doesn't necessarily reflect whether or not we've individualized ourselves. Okay, we'll explore this more in the future. Okay, so when do we begin to write our narrative? And why is this important? Well, researchers have found that we have just this innate disposition to narrativize events and to impose meaning on people's actions, to attribute mental states, to have a theory of mind. So essentially, we're saying that humans have a unique ability to believe that what we do reflects who we are and what kind of lives we lead, and that matters, right? So a narrative in our own mind could be the story we write about our behavior or the events that happen in our lives. So it could be very detailed, it could be very complex, or it could start out very simply like a child's, like a young toddler starting to tell their own stories about people in order to understand them. So it could be, or 2 or 3-year-old suddenly talking about the mailman delivering, packages at the holidays, and why does he do that? And, they start, it's narrative in toddlerhood is them realizing that people do meaningful things, and them telling these stories, them dressing up as, mailmen and firefighters and whatever, them taking on these characters, them playing make-believe is their way of understanding why people do what they do. And it comes out as a story, right? It comes out as kind of storytelling. And they do this for animals too, before they understand that animals don't share what humans do. Animals don't tell stories, and animals don't deliver mail and that kind of thing, right? So those are the beginnings of narrative. When you see a toddler playing dress up or telling mommy what they're doing and why they're doing it, they're just trying to make sense of all this new information that they've learned. Okay? So we do have to question, why is this an innate thing that we do? No one tells a toddler to dress up. I mean, no one tells a toddler to play. No one tells a toddler or teaches a toddler how to make believe, right? I mean, we kind of suggest it when they're babies, but they do this kind of innately, right? So going back to challenging that the brain is just a system, and realizing that it's much more experiential. It's much more about what the individual child is experiencing and how they create that narrative. Okay, so a couple more important things to consider. The infant is the center of a social world as soon as it leaves the womb. As soon as the baby is born, it is around people who are talking and interacting. It's interacting with the mother, right? In succeeding years, its development reflects its ability to understand how it relates to others and the world through narrative, through stories, through us documenting our lives. Okay, so when we say narrative could be the story that we tell of our experience. It could, it's just like our documentation of what's going on in our lives and why those events have meaning, right? So this begins as when the infant starts sharing attention with the mom, when the infant can point and interact with the mom deliberately, not just for food or shelter, that kind of thing, right? And then when it has an awareness of sharing the world with others, when the baby begins to play and laugh with others, when they intentionally try to speak to others, when they attempt to take on an adult role by that role play that we talked about, by dressing up, by little girls and little boys pretending their stuffed animals are their babies, right? Especially if they have a baby sibling. My little boy, I'll never forget when I brought my second baby home. My son was just 2, and he started watching me with her, and he watched me hold her and nurse her, and then he picked up his, little stuffed animals and would pretend to nurse them. That was him beginning his own narrative of taking care of things, right? And nurturing something. That's his own innate way of making sense of what I'm doing. And he's in turn learning how to be kind and take care of something, which all humans have to do. So what's important to know initially is that after 2 or 3 to 5 years, typically this language shifts from just being used as a vehicle for survival, feed me, I need food, to more complex, bonding with others, creating a mutual experience, right? And then eventually to an individual take on the world through play, right? All of that happens within the first few years. Okay, so we're going to talk about the transition from an ultimate self-awareness, toddlers realizing that they are autonomous beings in control of their own behavior, and then to other awareness, how other people behave and how our own actions affect others. So that obviously takes some time, right? Most toddlers don't have complete self-control, and they don't understand that what they do affects others because they just haven't reached that experience yet in their environment, and they also don't have the brain capacity yet. Okay, so experiential consciousness of early childhood is totally dependent upon the language used to exchange views of self and other, primarily through narratives, but also through commentary on the self by others. So, toddlers learn that they are responsible for their own behavior when they view the parents acting that way. So, if a mom drops something on the floor and is able to say, oops, I made a mess and I'm going to clean it up, the toddler is absolutely going to learn that. Maybe not every time, but in the future, if a toddler drops something, they're going to learn that it's okay, that they can pick it up, that they can clean it up, and that they can move on, right? Now, if a mom drops something and hurts herself, and maybe it's a bigger deal, and the mom is exasperated and acts out and swears or something, which we're all human, we've done it before, the child will pick that up as well. So that's what this is saying. Our children learn about the world through our commentary on our own behavior and how we interact mainly with the other caretaker in the home. Also, how we label our own feelings, our own thoughts, and our own expectations of what might happen. The mom citing her own feelings, labeling her own feelings, and a great mom starts doing this for her child to model. So a mom might see the child drop something and begin to get upset, and she might say, it looks like you're really sad right now, or it looks like you're feeling frustrated. Maybe we could do this. You know that the next time that the child experiences that, he's going to reflect back on when the mom said, looks like you're frustrated, and he might even say that, right? So he can learn to label his own feelings, and that's the development of his narrative. The last time I dropped something, Mommy said this, so I know it's going to be okay. Okay? Okay, so we're going to finish up discussion about transition on a final note. The last hallmark of this age where consciousness is really developing is the understanding or the beginning of the understanding of awareness of self, self and others, and timing. Okay, so toddlers, or we could say preschool age kids, 3 and up typically, live in a very here and now, they live in the present, right? They live in the moment, where many of us adults should be living more, right? But we're caught up in our nostalgic past and, what we have to do in the future. But ultimately, right around this age, kids are living moment to moment. They're highly experiential, they take in stimuli, and they respond, okay? Suddenly, given the appropriate environment that stimulates this, a child begins to realize that there is a past, a present, and a future. And this is critical, right? Because our lives run on time, right? Or timing, I should say. Okay, so when you start to talk about time to a toddler, they don't really get it at first. You talk about how we measure time, days of the week, months of the year, seasons. Mommy has to go to work for a couple hours and then she'll be home. Well, he doesn't or she doesn't understand what a couple hours means. The average adult can have a pretty good gauge of what a couple hours feels like. But to a toddler, that means nothing, right? Now, they begin to understand timing via their schedule, and that's why we tell parents scheduling and consistency in scheduling their lives is critical, because it's how they experience balance and it's how they learn about timing and how to how to run their lives in an organized way, right? So if you were to tell a toddler, as opposed to saying, Mommy will be home in a couple hours, you could say, Mommy will be home after lunchtime. Or if you're starting to teach your toddler about a clock, you could physically show what the hands on the clock are going to look like when you're going to return. And they can go on that, right? But telling your toddler, I'm going to be home in a couple hours, really doesn't mean anything to them until they can grasp what a couple hours feels like, which usually isn't until quite a bit older. Okay, so this is a big transition. What comes with the idea of the awareness of self in relation to others is the idea that events and the stories that we tell about other people do not happen to the child themselves, right? So whenever you tell a child a story about yourself as a kid, they have trouble depersonalizing that from themselves, right? So if your child is rocking in his chair at dinner and you can just tell that he is going to lose it, he's going to fall over in his chair, hit his head, cry, you're going to have a big mess, and you say, stop, don't rock in your chair. Well, of course, he's just going to want to rock more, right? We know that telling kids what not to do is just, they can't get that out of their head. They want to keep doing it. So you think, oh, I'll tell him when Mommy was a child, she was rocking in her chair at dinner, and you know what happened? Yeah, she fell on her head and she was very sad, right? So as your child's rocking and he thinks about that, maybe the next time he does it, he thinks, oh, I fell and hit my head last time, right? He doesn't think, no, that happened to Mommy, right? Kids at this age have a really hard time removing the narrative that they heard about someone else from their own life. So that's why it can be really difficult in more critical situations. Whenever a child is telling you that something happened to them, it can be really hard to discern the truth and the reality from the situation. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little story about Piaget. Piaget is a well-known figure in the psychology community, right? If you've ever taken a Psychology 101 class, or maybe in high school you were talking about human development, you've likely heard Piaget's name. Piaget is known for human development. He earmarked all the stages of development that we go through. Okay, so when Piaget was a child, I think he was 3, he had what they called a nursemaid. Okay, so like a nanny, um, who a nanny told his parents that she rescued him from a potential kidnapping when he was 3. Okay, so the nanny made up this big elaborate story and told his parents that she saved him from being kidnapped. Okay, and he overheard this and he actually drafted the all of the details in his mind to accommodate her story, when in fact this never actually happened. Come to find out, as an adult, he realized that, he was never almost kidnapped, and this was some elaborate tale that the nursemaid told his parents to impress them. Okay, but how does that happen? How can so many children be certain that events actually happened to them when in fact they happened to someone else, or they were just a big elaborate lie? Well, before we have an autonomous self, before we have a very distinct personal identity, when we hear stories and our imaginations are going, it's really hard to separate those and picture that they happened to someone else. So when you see kids really into a TV show or really into a story that you're telling them from a book even before they can read, you can see their little minds going, and they are picturing themselves experiencing. It's a very vicarious age, okay? So narrative, the storytelling, is the vehicle of communicating representations of events between people by a verbal means, right? So this verbal level is kind of the difference that activates the child's ability to tell stories with others, right? So this is how the child begins to create their own identity, is through narrative, right? So at some point, it becomes really important to differentiate my experience from your experience, to establish that there are different perspectives in the world, right? And for a young child, this is really critical, okay? So I'm going to give you a really quick, really brief monologue of a child talking about her father and experience he's having. Okay, and she's having a hard time figuring it out. She's 32 months, okay, so she's not quite 3. And her name is Emily. So listen to this. Today, Daddy went, trying to get into the race. She's talking about her daddy running a marathon. But the people said no, so he has to watch it on television. I don't know why that is, maybe because there's too many people. I think that's why he couldn't go in it. So he has to watch it on TV. On Halloween day, then he can run a race and I can watch him. I wish I could watch him. But they said, no, no, no. Daddy, 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 no, no, no. Have to watch on TV, but on Halloween day, he can run. Tomorrow he'll run? He says yes. My mom and dad and a man says you can run in the foot race, and I said that's nice of you, I want to. So next week I'm going to run to the foot race and run in the foot race because they said I could. So this is a typical, little girl trying to make sense of why her dad can't run in a marathon even though he wants to, and she's just totally puzzled by this. Okay, so her life has begun to expand beyond her own experience. Now she's considering the experiences of her father, and she can't predict what's going to happen. She can't explain what's going to happen. She still lives primarily in the present, but she's starting to realize that there is a future, and she's getting a growing awareness that other people have feelings and thoughts beyond hers, and that we can't necessarily control everything, right? So ultimately, how does all of this relate to consciousness? Okay, why is it so important for a child to suddenly realize that not everything is about them, or not everything comes from them, and that people have different feelings than them, right? Well, think about it. This is the beginning stages of identity, the critical challenge that we all face throughout our lives, right? It's just the beginning. Um, as soon as a child begins to realize that there is a past, present, and future, and that they are their own individuals, and what happens to them does not necessarily happen to everyone around them, and what they do can be responsible for others' feelings, is just the tip of the iceberg, right? So we're going to talk about this further in the next few chapters, but I just want you to continue thinking about how this development influences the future challenges of that child. You know, around 3, 4 years old, they're building an identity of their own that is autonomous. And they're beginning to tell their own stories to make sense of the things that are happening to themselves, but more importantly, to have things that are happening to others and how that relates to the world. Okay, so it's a lot to digest, but we'll talk about more of it in the future. So, what I want you to make sure that you've done for week 3, I want you to make sure that you've filled out your notes pages. Again, these notes pages are for you. I create the terms list so you can feel like you're on the same page and you're adequately preparing for your test. And then you're going to complete your discussion board post and your blog post. All right, see you in the next week.